Hey everyone, Brendan Snyder here. How are you? Thanks so much for joining me and welcome to Rush Album Ranking. Yes, this one's going to be a good one for sure. We got the Canadian rock legends Rush, who formed in '68, retired from touring in 2015, and then unfortunately with the sad passing of Neil Peart in 2020, Rush as we know it will never rise again. But this year they just released this Rush 50, a killer 4 CD box set for which I have done a full review on. You can check that out on the page. But this right here, celebrating 1974 to 2024, that's your 50 years, a little bit contradictory against the 1968 formation of the band, but all in all, a cool celebration going on. I thought, why not? Let's do a full, complete album ranking of all 19 studio albums, not taking into account the 11 live albums that they've done, but all 19 studio albums will be talked about in here. We're going to get into it in just a bit, but before we start, if you're new to my channel and you haven't already hit the subscribe button, please do. Also leave a comment, hit like, all those things do help support my channel. I greatly appreciate it. And of course, as an added bonus, by turning on notifications, you'll never miss an episode and stay up to date on really cool things like this with Rush and album ranking. So first off, I'd like to preference this video, this ranking, as being particularly hard, a lot harder than some other album rankings that I have done in the past. I don't feel that Rush has made a bad album. There's just albums that I like more than others, ones that I like less than others. And so the ones that I like less are going to appear lower on the ranking than the others, but it doesn't mean that I don't like the albums themselves. In fact, I actually like all of the Rush albums. There aren't any that I hate in here. So I just wanted to throw that out right at the beginning, because when you got 19, you got to put one in the last place, you know, and sometimes that just goes haywire with people. But let's go ahead and dive into it. Let's kick off with number 19. And for me, at least, Caress of Steel, 1975, third studio album. This one here was a follow-up to Fly By Night, 1975, which I think is a high watermark. You're going to see that one later on in here. But this one here lacks the power from that one and or the debut. And it just sort of felt rushed, in my opinion. Pun not intended, I guess. I love the track Bastille Day that's on here, but there's just some other stuff that's it's kind of mundane and it doesn't really gel with me. In particular, the song I Think I'm Going Bald is one that I don't particularly care for on here. I don't think that it has nearly the depth and power that other albums do. Musically, still sounds good on here, but it's just kind of overall a bit lackluster in my opinion. Meaning essentially I don't grab this one all that often. It doesn't really hold my attention the way other albums do. Remember, as I said, I do like all Rush albums, but this one just is one that I tend to reach for a lot less than other ones. All right, coming in at number 18, Vapor Trails from 2002, 17th studio album. Was the first album in 6 years for the band since Test for Echo had come out in 1996. It was the longest gap between two albums. For the first time, though, since Caress of Steel in 75, the band didn't use any keyboards. And unfortunately, I think that was a major detriment to this album overall. I get it, though, as part of, what they were trying to do and move away from that keyboard-laden sound that was so big in the 80s and even had continued into the 90s. A lot of bands were trying to distance themselves from it. They did that. There's still some very strong material on here, like the lead track that came off of the album, One Little Victory. When they announced that they were going to do the remix to it, and ultimately that came out because they first did that on one of the best of collections, had some remixes from this stuff. I really thought it was going to make me like the album a lot more, but all in all, the album just kind of has a very similar sound throughout it. And the remix, I almost can't tell the difference from the original mix of it, so it didn't really do anything, at least for me, on it. And all in all, again, still kind of finding this one very bland, not a lot of peaks and valleys or anything of that nature. So not really any standout elements of it that make me that grab my ear throughout. So it, again, another one that just doesn't get grabbed all that often. All right, coming in at number 17 is the debut Rush album, self-titled from 74. This one here, only one to feature original drummer John Aruzzi on it. Not quite as prog as the later day albums, but still a very good album. In fact, it's got a more straight ahead approach to it. And I really actually like this one a lot. But when I want Rush, I tend to grab other albums, not this one, but it is a nice album to swap out and get a little bit of a different feel. And that's one of the cool things that I like about Rush is all the different eras and feels that they went through for the styles of music. We're going to hit on that a bunch as we continue through this album ranking. Coming in at number 16, Clockwork Angels from 2012. 19th and final studio album, unfortunately. Prior to the album's release, though, they did release a double A side with two songs, Caravan and BU2B. They would later turn up on the album, and maybe because we had those for probably about a year before the album itself came out, they became the standout tracks, but I never really got into the rest of the album. For me, those two were the strongest songs. I had already heard those songs, so the fact that they turned up on here wasn't something that I then wanted. I wanted to hear new Rush by that point. And so it's a good, strong album. It's a great album that they went out on, but in my opinion, it doesn't have any of the high water marks that some of the other albums have that are going to make those rank higher than this thing here. It's just a bit even all the way through, and so that's why it's coming in at the position that it does. Coming in at number 15, Hold Your Fire from 1987, the 12th studio album from the band. Sort of final realization of the 80s era sound happened on this one here. Full on synths almost to an extreme on this thing here. While it had worked on previous albums, it didn't really have the same effect on this here. This one here just kind of came off as more of a pop sounding style than the other ones. The other ones merged very well with earlier styles of Rush. This one here just buried in the synth and keyboards and those sort of things that were on this album. A lot of great material still on this one. The overall issue for me on this album is I don't think that it flows as well as other albums. I am a child of the 80s. I do love the 80s era Rush. This is an album that I do grab and listen to, but there are ones that are better from the 80s than this one. And again, we'll be seeing those coming down the road here. All right, so number 14, Snakes and Arrows from 2007, their 18th studio album. This one here, an interesting follow-up to Vapor Trails of 2002, because while that one was very uninteresting to me overall, it was a little too even all the way through. This one here, I think by far made up for that itself. It was a very interesting blend of the electric and acoustic instrumentation, sort of breaking new ground for the band, creating another unique sound. Unfortunately, though, they didn't really stick with it. They broke some ground here, but in the end, they returned to what they did for Clockwork Angels in 2012. I wish they had continued on with this one more. I find this album to be far more interesting, obviously, than Clockwork Angels, which is why this one ranks a bit above that one. And all in all, throughout their 40 years from 68 to 2007, just great that they continued to experiment that far into their career that they did on this album here. All right, number 13, Presto from 1989. One of my favorite album covers from the band, but not as favorite overall album. Just happen to really like this album art, but 13th studio album. This was the first release that they did for the Atlantic Records, which was their new label at the time. And it was sort of a return to form album where ditching the overall 80s sound and bringing in more of the odd time signatures, and also at the same time returning guitar to the focal point. And so doing a real good job at that. There's some great tracks that are on this, in particular, The Pass. I always love that song from here, but I don't think it quite achieved what at least I wanted it to. I'm not sure what the band was necessarily going for. I think they had a far higher realization of what they were trying to do on follow-up album Roll the Bones from 1991, which again, we're going to see a bit later on. Coming in at number 12, Test for Echo, 1996, 16th studio album. While it's part of my favorite era from the band, the 90s era, I love it. Roll the Bones, 91, Counterparts, 1993, and this one here in 1996. Out of that trilogy, it's the, quote, worst, if you will, right? As I said, there aren't any that I hate, but the band sounds a bit tired on this album versus those other ones that I like better, but I still love this album. I've got, a nice nostalgic place for this because it's really kind of what I consider to be my era of the band. And, these rankings are always going to come down to when you got into the band, how old you are, all that sort of stuff, your influences. There's so much, those of you that are 10, 15 years older than me, you're going to love probably the 70s stuff more than me, and the 80s and the 90s and etc. That's how these album rankings always go. But this one here, while I find the lyrics to be a bit tired, repetitive, the music on here I think is still very strong, and therefore giving it that higher ranking than maybe it overall deserves, but I still like it, just my least favorite of the 90s era. Okay, coming in at number 11, Fly By Night from 1975, their second studio album, first to feature drummer Neil Peart, taken over from John Rutsey after the debut. He'd remained with the band, of course, until the band retired in 2015, and then unfortunately a sad passing in 2020. But first album where the band really developed their signature sound, especially on the title track here. Despite the album being a very strong album, in my opinion, it's never really fully connected with me the way other albums have. I like this album a lot. It's got some standout moments on it, but it's not what I would consider sort of like the perfect 10 albums, right? The ones that just have absolutely no filler, no tracks to skip, that kind of stuff. Not that I'm saying that the album suffers in any way, but reason why it's coming in where it comes in has a lot to do with those sort of things on it. But as I said, still a very solid album nonetheless. Okay, coming in at number 10, 2112, 1976, fourth studio album. While this one doesn't really have any of the radio staples on it, like some of their other albums, it does have a big 20-minute epic opener track on here. Fairly unique for the band at the time. While they did have an entire album side track on Caress of Steel in 75, that was the second and last song. So as an opener on an album, that was kind of a big deal, taking a big chance with it. Side 2 moves on to shorter radio style songs like Passage to Bangkok and Tears, which are two really excellent songs on here. I do have to say though, and you guys are probably already losing your minds because I brought this one in at number 10, but I've never fully understood the fascination that a lot of people have with it. I do think that has to do with my age and when I came into the band itself. It's a good album, but obviously I find 9 albums better than this one here. It's one of those ones that is good. I like parts of it. I definitely like the track Temples of Cyrenaics, which is part of the opening 2112 song itself, the 20-minute track, but having to wait to get to that and then all the extraneous stuff around it, in some cases, I think would have been better if they had broken it down into the individual tracks. But, I know 1976 was an entirely different era than what I grew up from, so the album is what it is. And as I said, I know some of you guys are probably flipping out about it, but hey, this is my album ranking. All right, coming in at number 9, Counterparts from 1993. Yes, I think this one is a lot better than the last one, but that's just me. You guys probably have a different opinion, and that is okay. So 15th studio album, one of the band's heaviest sounding albums. It was produced by Peter Collins. I always liked the work that he did. Definitely an album of the times, meaning 1990s. It fit in very well. It sort of had some down-tuned, darker style sounds to it than other albums. And it kind of emanates from where the musical times were with the alternative rockers. In this case, Rush actually managed to fit in nicely alongside, keeping the prog roots and what they had been doing. But boy, Rush was able to change with the times a number of times, the way that they did in the early 70s, the late 70s, the 80s, then the 90s, and now again with this release here. So I sort of consider this the third era of the band. You had the progressive rock of the 70s, you had the progressive pop of the 80s, and now the progressive alt rock of the 90s coming on itself. But all in all, making for a very cool album. All right, coming in at number 8, Power Windows from 1985, 11th studio album. This one here fully immersed in the 80s era sound, chock full of keyboards. But for me, it works extremely well. I know some of you guys don't like this album. This is often considered to be, I won't say one of the worst albums, but a lot of people do put Power Windows very low when doing album rankings and things. And for me, at least, I love the album. I always have. Sometimes a band's newer sound doesn't develop the way that it should, but in this case, from 1980 on to this album here, I think they developed it very well. It fit perfectly in with 1985. And all in all, this one here holds my attention all the way through on it. It's just, for me at least, it's connected on multiple levels, both musically and lyrically on it. It's immensely enjoyable for me at least. But, and I'll continue to preference this throughout the video. I am a child of the 80s, so those kind of sounds will always sound better to me than, say, somebody who grew up in the 70s. So you're going to get a lot of different album rankings from different people, especially with a band that has been around as long as Rush, having 19 studio albums, going through as many style changes as they did. Coming in at number 7, Permanent Waves, 1980, 7th studio album. First album where the band made a shift to that more concise song structure after a lot of long form style songs from the 70s, creating some real radio friendly hit songs off here, Spirit of Radio and Free Will. But still the band didn't leave behind their prog roots. I think it's one of the reasons that the album itself, is held in such high regard as it is. But, they did the right thing because at this time, prog rock bands were considered dinosaurs by 1980. And so for them to make that shift and be able to come out with those shorter style songs, I think really helped the band merge and hold on to being relevant throughout the 80s. And then they built upon that up to like Power Windows, where I said, they were still doing really good things by that point. So being able to make the change, find new audience members like myself who really tuned in for that sort of a thing is an amazing feat by any band, and certainly by Rush. Coming in at number 6, Grace Under Pressure, 1984, 10th studio album from the band. The band itself did not work with longtime producer Terry Brown on this one here, giving it probably a lean at least towards that different sound, but they worked with Peter Henderson on this one. And I think it added some new life to the album itself. Anytime you bring in some new blood into a band, and while we have the same 3 guys, bringing in a different producer can tend to do that. This one here really accentuates the synthesizer. It builds on it. I always saw that as a positive step that the band was doing for the 80s itself. That sound and what they were doing here on this one, adding a bigger, grander style to the band, fitting very well for the decade of excess that was the 80s. But I mean, what really is prog but a big, grand gesture? I always think the keyboards helped in that regard. And like I said, definitely brought in new fans like myself. All right, coming in at number 5, A Farewell to Kings, 1977, 5th studio album and follow-up to 2012 from 76. While that album, 2112, never really clicked with me, this one here did. Its album is much more my speed and pace. I think the song structures on here are right, holds my interest all the way through on this thing. Definitely connected to this album here, less disjunctive than the last album. You got some real cool standout tracks. The title track on here are Farewell to Kings, Xanadu, and of course the big radio hit Closer to My Heart, all making for a very strong opening to the album, but the rest of the album being very strong as well. Okay, and coming in at number 4, Hemispheres, 1978, sixth studio album, picking right up where Farewell to Kings left off, perhaps making this one a bit stronger. Don't know, but I do love this. For that reason alone, though, probably does set it up a little bit more. It doesn't quite have the standouts, the song, the concert staples, the radio hits like some of the other albums do, but the album itself, overall, from start to finish, I do think is very strong and consistent. Definitely a high water mark in terms of the progressive roots and era of the 70s sounds from this band, and my personal favorite of that era for this group. All right, coming in at number 3 might be a little controversial, don't know, but I love this album. It is a personal favorite of mine. Roll the Bones, 1991, 14th studio album. It was a return to commercial success for the band, so I know it, brought a lot of eyes back on to the band from this album here. The album itself felt more like hard rock than prog. I think it helped open the doors at that time. I know that I was not a big progressive rock fan, so I was very easy and able to slip right into this album here, featuring hits like Dreamline on here. That's the one that got me into this album, but also Roll the Bones, Ghost of a Chance on here. The thing is, the deep cuts, the album cuts on this one are just so good. Bravado, Where's My Thing is one of the best instrumentals. Neurotica. This album is what I consider to be a great driving album. I keep this one in my car. I will love this album through and through. Personal favorite, but we'll have to wait and see what comes in spots number 2 and then number 1. So on that note, let's see what number 2 is. Signals from 1982, ninth studio album, follow-up to Moving Pictures. The material for this one was prepared on the road, interestingly, during sound checks and, seeing what happens before and after the show, sort of a thing. But the band were just in the zone. They had toured for Moving Pictures. They were putting this thing together in that heightened sense as Moving Pictures was doing very well, and really sort of captured something amazing, I think, on this album. The album begins to emphasize that role of synthesizers. Despite people criticizing them for this, I do think that the change in sound from earlier albums is actually what made this album a transitional album and actually do as well as it did. Great standout tracks on this one that hold it all the way through: Subdivisions, Analog Kid, New World Man, Countdown. The album just has tons of great material on it. For me, being the new direction that the band was going in here was one of the things that made this album so good, and just extending and building on the overall career of the band. I think this album was a great transitional album that still holds up today. All right. I don't think it's any surprise, certainly at this point, but in general, coming in at number 1, Moving Pictures, 1981, 8th studio album. I mean, this thing has sold 4 million copies. It is their highest selling album. That is not why I'm putting it in the number 1 spot, but it's the album that really melds all the different styles of Rush. They did it well, at least up to that point. You got your prog-leaning style stuff melded with tighter, shorter song structures, certainly adopted for the times. The band really figured out how to do things right. Getting on radio for this one here. And it's an epic album that starts from the beginning. If you were a new listener at that time and Tom Sawyer comes on, blows your mind. I remember when I got this on vinyl for $1, the first time I heard that song. It's like nothing else, and it will be like nothing else. There will be generations of kids to come that are going to hear that song for the first time, minds will be blown. That reason alone, this album has to be number one for me. But then you've got Limelight on here. You got YYZ, one of the best instrumentals they ever did in their career. So all in all, this album, soup to nuts, a perfect album. Not a single song I skip on this thing. I would take this to a desert island. It is that good, but it is also the best album that Rush ever made, in my opinion. Again, remember, this is just my opinion, just my album ranking. I'm sure you guys have your own picks and selections. Which number one would you have? Let me know in the comments. But this here at least is my album ranking for all 19 studio albums. All right, everyone, take care. Have a good one. And I'll talk to you real soon. Bye-bye.